Stay-at-home orders at midnight this Friday. Those restrictions will now continue for at least another week. I want to bring in my political panel this afternoon. I'm joined by Liberal MP Tim Wilson in Melbourne and Labor MP Dr Anne Aly in Perth. Welcome to both of you.
Thanks for having us.
Tim, last year you joined other coalition members attacking Melbourne's lockdown, saying politicians are immorally trading away younger Australians' opportunities. You also said lockdowns will become less sustainable. So is Sydney right to keep COVID restrictions for another week, including closing schools?
Well, I absolutely believe that if you continue in a rolling lockdown in perpetuity, or you constantly use a sole mechanism, that it's a problem. But and it does mean that it does have very serious human consequences. But this is up ultimately for, I was talking about the Victorian one, and I am obviously a Victorian. This is one for New South Wales residents, and I'll leave it, of course, to the New South Wales MPs and, of course, their government to decide these matters. But I don't and never have believed that lockdown should be the first resort. I don't believe that they're desirable. The challenge is making sure that if we are to utilise them, and sometimes we've found in this pandemic they may be necessary in the circumstances, that they're as short, sharp as possible. But obviously, based on the New South Wales experience, they don't believe that's the case at this time. OK,
and we know that Dominic Perrottet went into Cabinet, according to the Australian newspaper, and argued against this extension. Are you sympathetic with that view?
Well, I'm sympathetic with any position that starts with not having people in lockdown, but there are lots of challenges we face. We've been very successful as a country. In fact, we're in many ways the victims of our own success by succeeding in keeping the virus out of Australia, whereas almost every other country, bar New Zealand, has not been able to do so. As a consequence, there are measures that the Australian public is prepared to tolerate in terms of keeping the virus out until we're in a position where hopefully we can resume some normalcy, whereas other countries having rolling lockdowns serve a specific purpose. The specific purpose was to ease the pressure on our public health systems to make sure that they were in a position to support those people who need ICU and access to respirators. But I reassert very strongly that lockdowns are not a desirable public policy view. I doubt that would be different from the view of Daniel Andrews or Gladys Berejiklian, I might add.
OK. If I can bring you in, Dr Anne Aly, New South Wales Health Minister Brad Hazzard says the state may never control its current COVID-19 outbreak and be forced to live with the virus for good as a result of this outbreak. What do you make of those comments today?
Thanks, Patricia. Look, I think the real issue here is about our failure to pivot. And by that I mean pivoting to a situation where the measure of success against COVID is no longer about how many or how few lockdowns you have or even how long they go for, but how many people are vaccinated. And that's going to require, or should have required, quarantine facilities, a timely vaccine rollout, a concerted communication campaign and a robust vaccine supply. On all of those four measures, Scott Morrison has dismally failed. And so what we see now is we see Australia in a position where we have to rely on lockdowns while the rest of the world moves forward because they've got a majority of their adult population vaccinated and the risk of COVID is no longer vested in or focused on serious illness or hospitalisation or death. We're going to have to get to that point. We should be at that point. Much of the world is at that point.
So are you worried then that Brad Hazzard suggests that perhaps we'd, you know, if they can't control it, they obviously don't want to stay in lockdown for a long period of time, that it would exist, that we would have this particular outbreak around before they're at that critical level of vaccination?
Well, my point is that until we get a critical level of vaccination, we have to rely on lockdowns. So this is going to be an ongoing issue that we deal with. The underlying issue here is vaccination and getting a majority of the population vaccinated so that we can live with COVID in a way that much of the world has now pivoted to living with COVID.
OK, so Tim Wilson, on that, obviously the slow vaccine rollout is really key here, isn't it? I mean, we wouldn't have our second year of lockdowns and New South Wales being in this position if we were able to get out of it with the vaccinated population, right?
No, that's false. The reality is there are plenty of countries on earth that have vaccination rates well above 50% who are using lockdowns because of the pressures that are faced by their public health system and because of new variants. Now, I would say that we should be very cautious about following that approach, but it's actually just a fatuous, deliberate attempt to mislead the public by the Labor Party because they want to keep scoring political points rather than dealing with the substantive issue,
okay, so
which
what
is
do you
public
think?
health.
Let me
now, what
put
we're
this
on our
to
way
you.
to doing is getting the 8 millionth Australian vaccinated. And the reality is that vaccination rates in the countries that are highest are because they have the highest death rates and the highest sense of urgency. The trade-off for many countries is that you might have a very high vaccination rate, but that's because you have many of your citizens that are deceased from COVID-19. We are in a privileged position in this country of being able to keep the virus out.
Yeah.
The challenge is how we're then going to confront
So let
and
me put that
addressing
to
the
you.
new
When we
challenge
get
of
to-
recognising people need to be vaccinated
When we
while
get
also
to a
making
higher
sure that
level
we get to a
of
position
vaccination,
where people were able
you're
to
doing a
reopen
really good job of
international
just
borders.
talking through my question.
No,
When we
because
get
I just think I had the right to finish the question when you asked it.
yeah, you went on too long, clearly.
No,
So-
you just wanted to engage in a different point.
Yes, I did. As the host of the program, I wanted to go to a different point. Correct, Tim Wilson. And this is the point. Here it is. When we get to 50% vaccination, right? Should we then, will we still have lockdowns? Do you think we should be prepared for continuing lockdowns at that stage?
Well, my hope is that's not the case, but where some people have nominated 50%, some against the national roadmap of the 4 stages to get to a different COVID normal. I think moving from stage 1 to stage 2 probably require about 60%. I've said that publicly previously, but the first position we should get to, I would hope, is to stop having state border closures and also stop having lockdowns. But that's obviously going to be informed in part by a medical decision. Of course, it's going to be up to state premiers and the extent to which we're prepared to have an honest conversation with the public about the fact that there's going to be a point where we're going to have to reopen international borders. The reality is when we do that, there's going to be the risk of the virus entering Australia, and that's more the reason why people should go out and get vaccinated now to make sure they're in the best position. So if that occurs, we're in a position where people are as resilient and strong as possible to resist the consequences, to transmit it the least, and to protect the health and well-being, not just of yourselves, but in terms of your responsibility to your fellow citizens.
Yeah. Today we know that the Treasurer had this meeting with business leaders about trying to get vaccinations through workplaces. Dr Anne Ali, is that a good approach? I mean, it seems sensible, doesn't it? You get sort of a Bunnings, you know, sausage and a vaccination when we have enough supply. It seems like an ideal day to me.
Oh, really? An ideal day is a Bunnings sausage and a vaccination. I like that. I like that, Patricia. Look, I think it is a good idea, but the problem is, you know, do we have the supply to do that? Do we have enough supplies of different vaccines to do that? And I think that the underlying issue through all of this is that the government has failed to secure a robust supply of vaccines. That is why the vaccine rollout is slow. And, you know, I kind of zoned out with Tim's answer earlier, somewhere between him trying to blame Labor and then trying to blame the states. But I reiterate again, and, you know, I think through all of that, what Tim was saying was exactly what I was saying, that vaccination is key. So you have to have a timely vaccine rollout, and you have to have clear messaging around that. On those 2 issues, there is no doubt that the Scott Morrison government has failed.
Okay. Just on another issue which kind of blew up yesterday, New South Wales Health Minister Brad Hazzard labelled a question about the vaccination of 160 Sydney private school boys as embarrassing. Now, Tim, should New South Wales Health be embarrassed they gave the jab to 160 teenagers while there are still unvaccinated aged care workers? We know that they say it was a mistake because they were trying to vaccinate the Indigenous students, but clearly, you know, the entire cohort turned up.
Well, it's obviously an error, and it's one that they've admitted, which I think is the first basis to rebuild public trust. But, you know, I'm of the view that we should be seeking to vaccinate as many Australians as possible. Of course, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders fit as part of a critical part of that conversation, but young Australians also fit as part of it. So there was obviously an error. The error was made. They acknowledged it and admitted it and aren't seeking to repeat it. If the minister's embarrassed, that's his choice. But in the end, they're Australian citizens, and I don't believe that we should be embarrassed to have vaccinated Australian citizens, only that there are some errors, and there no doubt will be other errors into the future in the health system.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose the issue is not, of course, you're not embarrassed about vaccinating, but there are priorities, right? Like you want to get your old people vaccinated before young,
We want
strapping
people who are more vulnerable to be in a position where they're vaccinated based on a priority and based on the risk they pose to themselves, but also to others, also the virus risks themselves, and also potential transmission to others. And so they've obviously made an error, but that they acknowledge it. I'm not going to beat them up over it when it's what seems to be a simple error.
What do you think, Dr. Anne Ali? I mean, I know a lot of people, at least in the social media space, were rather outraged.
Oh, it might be a simple error, but it's a simple error with some pretty significant consequences, right, Patricia? I mean, you've got people in aged care facilities and aged care workers who aren't being vaccinated. You've got people who want to be vaccinated but can't find the supply of vaccination. And then they see on the media that an elite private boys' school has all been vaccinated. It is incredibly embarrassing, and he's right to feel embarrassed by it. I'm not going to show any sympathy to that.
All right, just if we can end on another story which emerged this week. Starting with you, Anne, there have been a number of headlines from former Liberal MP Julia Banks's new book this week, an allegation of inappropriate touching from an unnamed cabinet minister, stories of her interactions with Prime Minister Scott Morrison too. She's obviously talking about a broader culture as well, about, women and the way women are included in politics. What do you make of her revelations?
Oh, I think she's, I fully support Julia. I think it's incredibly brave of her to speak out against this. And I think that, if it's happening to a female parliamentarian, then, in a fairly equal power relationship with another parliamentarian, imagine what's happening to those not on an equal power relationship. I also want to mention I was very disappointed with Sarah Henderson's response. For people to say, well, I haven't seen it and it hasn't happened to me, there's a kind of an underlying trying to gaslight the victim here, and saying, it hasn't happened to me, so therefore it mustn't have happened to anyone else. That's rubbish. Just because it didn't happen to you or just because you didn't see it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And trying to undermine somebody's allegations here, I think it's not what's expected. I think women need to stand together on this, and I was pretty disappointed with the response and some of the responses that she's been getting.
Yeah, Tim Wilson, this is what she says happened to her. Just because it didn't happen to someone else doesn't mean it didn't happen to her, right?
Well, I haven't seen her remarks, so I won't comment. But, of course, it's very disappointing in any workplace in Australia. If people experience sexual harassment, we shouldn't stand for it, and we should respond. And, people unfortunately have, in those situations, have a choice about how they respond to it, but it shouldn't happen in the first place, so they needn't have to respond to it. But in saying that, one of the broader challenges we have, and this is not in the context of the allegations she was making there, but in the context of the allegations or the broader conversation around power, one of the big challenges with Parliament and with politics is that it's a dynamic of power and people seeking to influence and exercise that power over others. Anne knows what it's like to have to conform to a party view. I do, or know what it's like to have people have put pressure on you, and it's a very difficult environment and one that raises lots of questions about how people interrelate to each other, and particularly when it comes down to policy or issues like leadership ballots and the like.
Do you believe Julia Banks?
Oh, well, I believe the allegation of sexual harassment. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, like her revelations. Do you believe her?
Yes, I do. And I'm disturbed by it, like anybody else would be.
Yeah, Good. It is disturbing. Well, it is disturbing. Thank you so much to both of you for joining me.
Thanks, Patricia.
Liberal MP Tim Wilson and Labor MP Dr. Anne Ali. Well,